Hey friends, Brother Judd here with this week's Institute lesson. This one's a doozy. We go through all types of situations, some that are inspiring and some that are just downright awful. So strap yourselves in, grab your scriptures. We'll be going through a large period of history. This video would be hours long if I were to go through everything that's contained in the books of Joshua and Judges. But this is just a crash course, so if you want the details, you're going to have to jump into some of those chapters on your own. But before we get to there, as mentioned this week, we'll be looking at Joshua and the Judges. Next week, we'll slow down and just take a look at the book of Ruth, a story that is much more manageable than looking at all of the stories in Joshua and Judges. After that, we'll look at Saul, David, and Solomon, the three kings, oftentimes referred to as the golden age of Judaism. Talk about the things that they do right and the things that they get wrong. After that, we'll look at the wisdom literature, things that we find in Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And then into that first week in August, we'll take a look at the book of Job, which is also considered to be part of that wisdom literature. So that's the program for the next few weeks. When we look at where we are, if you think about kind of Moses on one side and King David on the other side, Joshua there, he comes right after Moses, but the majority of, at least when you're looking at kind of the timeline of what's going on with Israel, is going to be contained there in the book of Judges. And so, as mentioned before, lots of things are going on. The Bible is horrible at giving us an idea of passage of time. But just know that here in the book of Judges, once we get to it, we're going to be, going, 30, 50 years at a time. And, it might even just be a few chapters in a verse. So just to give you an idea, if you find your head spinning a bit as to, whoa, we were just over here doing this, and now it's something else. Well, again, Judges covers a lot of ground, so just to keep that in mind. And then once we get up to the prophet Samuel and King David, things slow back down, and we get a better idea of what's going on. But when we look here at the book of Joshua, Joshua's name, Yeshua, it means Jehovah saves, or Jehovah is salvation in Hebrew. And he's got a Herculean task ahead of him. Moses is the great deliverer. He's gone across the Sinai Peninsula with them for 40 years. They come to the borders of the River Jordan. They're going to cross over into the Promised Land. Moses is told he's not allowed to cross over with the people, but instead he's taken into heaven. And Joshua is told that he is going to be the new guy. And so there in Joshua chapter 1, verse 5, as Joshua is a bit apprehensive about taking over things, the Lord says, "There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee." And this is indeed something that the Lord substantiates, just as Moses, one of the great miracles that he performs is the parting of the Red Sea. As Israel crosses the River Jordan, the story, and it's depicted here in this artwork, the story is the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Tabernacle, they get to the River Jordan. It looks like this is going to be way too difficult to cross. The Lord tells Joshua, instruct the priests to go walk into the river, and as soon as their sandals touch the water, you'll see what happens. And so, indeed, they believe Joshua. They do what he asks them to do. As soon as their feet hit the water, then the water starts to pile up in a heap. And I'm sure everybody looks at Joshua and they think, whoa, Moses, okay, yeah, there's some similarities here. And that comforts us when we lose a leader that has especially done a lot of wonderful things for us. We're a bit hesitant about what's going to happen next. In fact, there's a term in literature that often gets thrown around where we talk about something being the Joshua generation. It's that group that comes after all of the miracles happened, and oftentimes they run into a lot of difficulty because they didn't get to see these things and feel the feelings with their own hearts. They have to rely on the reports of their parents and their aunts and uncles and grandparents, those who have gone before, to give them a sense of the miraculous. And so oftentimes we see these cycles go through societies where one generation will really struggle and be delivered from something, and the next generation doesn't seem to have the fortitude that the generation of their parents and grandparents seem to have. So, and that's definitely the case here with Israel. But Joshua, here in chapter 1, verse 9, the Lord, through Joshua, tells Israel, he says, "Look, have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest." Because the Lord's going to ask them to go into a new land, and it's already occupied, and they're worried about what's going to happen. One report is there are giants in the land. How can we fight these guys? Probably thinking about the Philistines, if Goliath is any indication of an inherited trait for large stature and great strength. But they are afraid. But Joshua is the one who leads them through all of these different battles and fights and intrigues, and he is the man for the time. The first encounter that they come to is here at the city of Jericho, the great walled city of Jericho. And the Lord gives Israel an interesting way of conquering the walled city of Jericho. He tells them for 7 days to walk around the city, to grab their shofar, the ram's horns, out of which they make literal horns, and they blow through them. That they're supposed to go around the city 7 times. Then on the 7th day, they're meant to go around the city 7 times, and then blow their trumpets, and the people shout. And then there in Joshua chapter 6, verse 20, it records, "So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets, and it came to pass that when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell, the wall fell down," apologies for the typo, "fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city." And it seems like a fantastic way to capture things, both for, well, it gets rid of the fortifications, but also the people who were in the city, having seen, I'm sure they mocked Israel as they're walking around, like, "Hey, what are you guys doing with your trumpets? And you're walking around the city once a day." But then when they see the walls come down, that I'm sure they are convinced as well. But the commandment is to go in and to lay waste to the city, to destroy everything, to kill the people. And the Israelites were not to take any spoils for themselves. In fact, they were supposed to take any of the riches of Jericho, and they were meant to go to the temple treasury. People were not meant or supposed to enrich themselves with the sacking of Jericho. Instead, they were meant to take these things and to offer sacrifice to God with them. Now, not everyone in Jericho was killed. You'll recall, and I think it's in the 2nd chapter of Joshua, that he sends a couple of spies, and there is a harlot, a woman named Rahab, who takes these Israelites in. She hides them from the Jericho officials, and she has them covenant with her that when Israel indeed does show up, that because of her kindness, that she and her kindred, her family, her kinsmen, that they would all be spared. And so indeed, when the walls fall and Israel comes into the city, chapter 6, verses 22 and 23 read, "But Joshua had said unto the 2 that had spied out the country, Go into the harlot's house, and bring out thence the woman and all that she hath. As ye share, man, I really should have taken better care to make sure I was typing these out right. And all that she hath, as ye, probably swear unto her. And the young man that were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brethren and all that she had, and they brought out all her kindred and left them without the camp of Israel." There's something really beautiful to this story about a woman who, by all indications, the law of Moses, there's no allowance for immorality, and especially where you have a woman who is not of Israel, who engages in a very immoral act, that she does a very moral thing in the hiding of these spies. She very easily could have turned them in, thinking that, hey, I can get a great reward from the officials here in Jericho if I turn these spies in. But I wonder if her heart is pricked. She knows this is the right thing to do. Regardless, her life is spared and the life of her family is spared. And so we have this woman who, the Old Testament oftentimes, well, not just the Old Testament, but a lot of Scripture kind of operates in these binaries of, religious in-groups and religious out-groups. But as you go through and you look at the nuances of this, God often chooses an individual in the out-group to help the in-group and even teach the in-group some lessons. So I'll show you what I mean. What happens is as they sack the city of Jericho, there was a man named Achan, and he comes from a family of the camp of Israel. He's a religious insider. He has everything going for him. But instead of taking the wealth of Jericho to the temple, he chooses to hold on to some things for himself. And so what happens is after Jericho, they go over to the city of Ai, and they summarily are defeated. And the people all kind of look around like, what happened? I thought we had the Lord on our side. And then the Lord comes to Joshua and he says, somebody's not keeping the commandments that I told them to. And the Lord comes to Joshua and he says, it's somebody in this particular tribe, it's somebody in this particular family. Actually, it's this guy. And so Joshua calls Achan out and he confesses. And eventually, Achan, who is of the covenant, he and his family are all killed. And contrast that to Rahab, who is not of the covenant, that she and her family, they are all spared. So there's a very interesting juxtaposition there, where we have a man who is of the covenant, who is supposedly doing all the right things, who brings destruction to his family, where there's a woman who is of a very suspect, put it that way, profession, not of the covenant, that because of her following her heart and what she feels like is the right thing to do with these spies, that she brings salvation to her family. I don't think those stories are juxtaposed just haphazardly. I think there's something that the Lord is trying to teach us in keeping these stories there. Rahab, she shows up again in Hebrews in the list of the righteous that the Apostle Paul shares there in his epistle to the Hebrews. So again, when we operate in these binaries of, well, I'm in the covenant and these people are not of the covenant, or I'm righteous and you're wicked, or just be very, very careful, because as you're going to see throughout a lot of this, we have some covenant people doing some pretty awful things, and some Gentiles, some non-covenant people who come to the rescue and help bring about the Lord's purposes. So anyway, interesting stories. What happens after that is they go through after the city of Ai. They conquer a number of other cities. Joshua chapter 11 verse 23 records, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land, there's another one, and the land rested from war. And I know a lot of people, when they go through and read the story of the Lord telling them to utterly lay waste to a bunch of these different cities and peoples, that we think, how could a loving God possibly do such a thing? Now, we also have to, it would be a bit disingenuous unless I bring up the point that, sure, the Lord tells them to destroy the Canaanites, which the book of Joshua records them doing, but then when you get over to the book of Judges, there are Canaanites again in the land. And so how can the book of Joshua say everyone in this particular area was destroyed, but then in the very next book we have, no, they're not destroyed. In fact, there are quite a few of them, and the Israelites start worshiping their gods. So how can one book say one thing and another book say another thing? This is another place where understanding kind of the word is escaping me, the genre of the different books. So again, Bible is a collection of books, okay? The same Latin root words, bibliothek, a word for library in a few different languages. The Bible is a library, a collection of books, and not all books are written with the same intent. The book of Joshua, to a certain extent, seems to be, conquering literature, where Israel really doesn't seem to do anything wrong. Now, again, you have that story of Achan and his family, but still, Joshua brings him to justice. As soon as that little bit of unrighteousness is rooted out, then things just go well. And they, every single other case that they get into, they seem to do pretty well. Now, there was this small thing with the Gibeonites where they're able to get Joshua to make a covenant with them, which, there's some subterfuge on their part, but, eventually things get squared away. I won't go into. You can look them up if you're curious. But still, the book of Joshua, as I mentioned, is just, it's a lot of conquering language. In a similar way, when you watch highlight film for any professional sports team, you can take the worst sports team in, say, the NBA, and if you watch their highlight reel, it looks like they make every single shot. They play incredible defense. And if you judged that team based on its highlight reel, you'd be like, why didn't these guys win the championship? I mean, they look like they are incredible. And again, that's kind of what's going on here in the book of Joshua. Is not that it's duplicitous, but it's written with the intent to show, the Lord was with Israel. They were able to go through and conquer as long as they have the Lord with them. And the only way they did not conquer is when they had disqualified themselves from the Lord's help. So we have to ask, what's this written for? Who's the audience? The intent of the author and all of that. And now it is. I mean, they go through and they conquer all of these places. So those parts are not falsified at all. But the extent to which, everything is killed doesn't necessarily happen. But still, that makes us a bit uncomfortable about, gosh, that just... we'd like to tell ourselves, if we were there, we'd probably maybe, go up to Joshua and be like, we really shouldn't be just killing these women and children. That's not okay. I came across this interesting idea from Robert George. He's a legal scholar at Princeton, Catholic man, if I have my facts straight. He Interesting intellectual. I really enjoy some things that he writes. Other things I have to take a step back and think, well, I'll have to think about that one, see where he's coming from. But I really enjoyed kind of this take on, as he's teaching law classes there at Princeton University. They get into talks of slavery and historic injustices and whatnot. And he asks his students, if you had lived in the South, the southern United States, before slavery was abolished, how many of you would have been abolitionists? And of course, everyone raises their hand because we all want to be on the right side of history and think we would be on the right side of history. And then he pushes back a bit. And he shared this in a blog post back in 2017, I think it was. But here's what his response was. He said, when everybody raises their hands and said we would have been on the right side of history, he said, so I respond to the students' assurances that they would have been vocal opponents of slavery by saying that I will credit their claims if they can show me evidence of the following. That in leading their lives today, they have embraced causes that are unpopular among their peers and stood up for the rights of victims of injustice, whose very humanity is denied, and where they have done so knowing, and then he comes up with a few things that we'd have to be able to show evidence of in order to think we would have been the few standing up, to Joshua saying, no, we can't kill these women or children, or standing up to slavery in the American South, or standing up to any number of historical atrocities. And so these were his criteria for letting us be the heroes of our stories and wanting to be on seeming the right side of history. And he says, one, you'd have to make sure that it would make them unpopular with their peers. So slavery, going through and and getting rid of the Canaanites, again, whatever atrocity it might be, we'd have to be going against the cultural grain. And so today, are we standing up for those things that kind of society elites are standing for, or are we really pushing against those? So I'll stop editorializing and I'll just read what he said. So it would make you unpopular with their peers, that they would be loathed and ridiculed by wealthy, powerful, and influential individuals and institutions in our society. That it would cost them friendships and cause them to be abandoned and even denounced by many of their friends. That they would be called nasty names, and that 5, they would possibly even be denied valuable educational and professional opportunities as a result of their moral witness. In short, my challenge to us, is to show me where they have at significant risk to themselves and their future stood up for a cause that is unpopular in elite sectors of our culture today. So again, I don't want to excuse historical atrocities, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves and not be so egocentric that, hey, if we had lived back then in those situations, we would have done the right thing. I know it's very comfortable to tell ourselves that, but that's what happens next in the book of Judges, is Israel's history through Judges is not comfortable at all. It tells the story for how it is, and it's a history that God's covenant people have to look at and have to come to terms with and realize in the stories we tell ourselves, we don't always do the right things, and we need to be honest about that. So moving over to the book of Judges, we have 12 judges. I'm not going to go through and tell you stories about all 12 of them. I've picked out just a few. But these judges, it seems to be, there's this cycle, and it'll sound very similar to the Book of Mormon. There's a cycle of where Israel gets a bit proud, so then they get humbled, and then the Lord sends them a judge that helps them humble themselves again, in which they become prosperous and very proud again, and they just go through these cycles over and over and over. Now, interesting thing about the judges, with some of them, we have a better idea of them being officially called to be a judge of Israel. Others, we have no idea whatsoever how they come to occupy this space of being a leader. Now, it's called the Book of Judges, and these 12 are referred to as judges, but it's not necessarily that they just sit there, adjudicating things as we might think a judge does. But they're seen as leaders, they're seen as military commanders, they're seen as religious influencers, not just acting as judges as we might think. So Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar, there are some interesting stories there in the opening chapters of Judges, but I'm going to skip through those. But when we get to the story of Deborah, she sits there underneath a tree. She renders judgment to the people in any number of situations. She's referred to as a prophetess. She is recognized as being a wise woman who is able to receive and to tell the people about how things are going to go. There's a particular instance where Barak, who is a commander of Israel's military, he comes to Deborah and he says, "Hey, we're really having a hard time with." Oh, it escapes me. Who are they after? I can't remember at the time. Anyway, it's one of we'll just say one of the Canaanites. That's a blanket term for the groups there. We can never defeat the Canaanites. They have a much larger army than we do, and they have iron chariots. We can't beat them. And he goes to Deborah, and Deborah receives inspiration that if they go to a particular mountain and gather their forces there, that they will indeed become victors. And Barak, he's a little hesitant, and he says, "I don't know about this. Will you come with me?" And Deborah says she will, and in Judges 4:9, and she said, "I will surely go with thee, notwithstanding the journey that thou takes shall not be for thine honor, for the Lord shall." Man, all of these. I swear I checked these. I wonder if when I would move to the next slide, if I don't know. My guess is spell check is grabbing a bunch of these. Because I thought I did a much better job at these. But The Lord shall sell, it says Sizer there. That's not the right term. I don't have my scriptures here right in front of me. But shall sell the host of the Amalekites or the Canaanites or whoever it is into thy hand of a woman. And Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And so she said, yeah, I'll go with you, but you're not going to get the credit for this great victory. So what happens is they go there, and Barak, he looks down and he sees the opposing forces in their chariots, and he's real worried. How is this going to work? And then out of nowhere, the storm comes and just renders the land a complete muddy mess in which chariots do not operate very well. Well, that emboldens Israel. They rush down the hill, lay waste to the opposing army, but their army's general, he takes off, he gets out of there. He comes to the tent where another woman named Jael, she is there, and, you know, he asks for lodging and for safety, and if the Israelite spies come by to say he's not here, well, she doesn't do that. She lets him come in and stay the night, but before he leaves, she takes a tent stake or a tent post and kills him with it. And so she is the one who is credited with the victory, fulfilling the prophecy of Deborah. And Barak there, he gets mentioned in the story, but he's not the one who gets to take credit for this victory. So that's a bit about the prophet Deborah. We go down to the story of Gideon, and again, Israel, they find themselves fighting people again, that they've given themselves over to the worshiping of false gods. They're worshiping the Canaanite gods and the Amorite gods and the Moabite gods. They're worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth and a number of others. It seems that they're worshiping anybody but Jehovah. And so Gideon, he comes and he is commanded by an angel to break down an altar to Baal in his town. And so he does it at night. You know, he can tell this is not going to be a popular thing, but he does what he's told to do, and so he breaks down the altar. When it's found out what he does, his family brings him in front of all of the town, and they say, "Hey, you have to kill this guy for smashing our altar." And Gideon, he pulls one. He says, "Well, do you have to defend Baal? Do you need to defend this god, or can he defend himself? You know, if he's a strong enough God, let him defend himself, and let him consume me by fire or something." And it doesn't happen, and they see, oh, well, okay, and everybody kind of goes their way. But what Gideon does is he again amasses an army to fight off the oppression of some of the other Canaanite tribes. Now again, Joshua says that all of these people are gone. Nope, Book of Judges says they're still around. And what the Lord tried to prevent in getting Israel to not commingle and intermarry and to be socialized by people, that doesn't happen. They start worshiping these false gods, learning bad practices. Human sacrifice is still going on there. Worship that involves a whole lot of immorality. They're falling for all of it. But Gideon, he is going to fight off against some of these oppressive peoples who are subjugating Israel to their wishes. And so he gathers a group, and the Lord comes in Judges 4:9 and says to Gideon, "And the Lord said unto Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me." And so they pare the army down. It gets smaller. The Lord says, nope, still too big. They make it smaller. The Lord says, nope, still too big. They make it smaller. And eventually Joshua does this thing where he takes some people to a well, and those who lap up the water like a dog versus those who bring the water to their mouths. It's those who lap the water up like dogs that he says, these are the 300 that I'm going to take with me. And so they have this group of 300 versus a host of roughly 3,000, not 3,000, of 10,000. It's like 9,445 or something like that. And what they do, and that's the picture depicted here, is they take horns, not trumpets like these, but shofar, those ram's horns, and they take lanterns and they surround the Midianites by night. They break their lamps. They start blowing their horns. There's such a commotion that's caused in the camp. The Midianites start fighting amongst themselves. It emboldens the Israelites. These 300, they rush in, and then a bunch of the other Israelites, they hear about what's going on. They can come in also, and sure enough, Gideon is able to rout the opposing force, and there's another win for Israel in that way. Now, I wish the story of Gideon ended well. Unfortunately, the people, they want to make him a king, and he says, no, you're not going to worship me. You're going to worship the Lord. But he asks for some of the spoils of their wars to be given to him, in which they make him something that kind of becomes idolatrous-like. There are some stories throughout the books of Judges in 1st and 2nd Samuel where this ephod, it was a part of the priest's religious dressing that they wore, and Joshua wanted one like that, and so they make one of these for him, and eventually it seems like even though he doesn't want to be king, he too kind of falls for a version of idolatry and worshiping not necessarily the true and living God, but he wants to worship God in his own way, and eventually Israel falls into apostasy again. So we go from Deborah and Gideon. Deborah seems to be out and out pretty great. Gideon, the first part of his life's pretty good. After him, though, things don't go so well. He has a number of sons who cause some trouble. Not going to go through Tola and Yair, but you get down to Jephthah. This is a fascinating, super sad story. Again, Israel has fallen for idolatry. They find themselves being conquered by other tribes. And Jephthah, he vows a vow that, I don't know if it's overzealousness to keep his vow. I don't know exactly what's going on here. This is just a tragic, tragic story. Judges chapter 11, verses 30 and 31. It says, And Jephthah vowed a vow unto the Lord, and said, If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. And so he goes home, and I'm sure in his mind he's thinking, it's going to be a dog, or it's going to be a sheep, or a cat. Something is going to come, because often, you would have, in agrarian cultures, you would have, livestock that would come in and out of homes and whatnot. That was just a normal thing. But it's not an animal, it's his daughter that comes out of the door. And he blames her, and he says, how could you have done this? And she very humbly says, if you need to keep your vow, then I understand. Just let me and my friends go lament that I will never be a mother for a couple of months, and then I'll come home and you can do what you have to do. And so he does. He sacrifices his daughter, and it's just this horrible, horrible story. So do you admire his commitment to keeping his covenant? I have a hard time doing that in light of him sacrificing his daughter. At what time does, how do you balance one's religious zeal with just being a good father? And, you wish it could have been an Abrahamic type of thing where, there's a ram that shows up and the angel stays his hand and says no. Or was it his own foolishness for making a covenant that he shouldn't? I don't know. That's tough. So in our discussion on Tuesday night or Wednesday, I'd love to talk through that one with you if you're interested. I'm going to skip the next three and get over to Samson. This is probably the best known of the judges. Samson has become synonymous with one having great strength, which indeed Samson seemed to have. He was raised as a Nazirite, which, if you remember our discussion of the law of Moses, that was a particular holiness code where you were given specific promised blessings if you were able to maintain this increased holiness. Maybe it's not even holiness, but this increased sense of devotion. I guess maybe we'll put it that way. But his mother, he's told that you're to raise your son as a Nazirite. There are very few births that are attested to by angels, and Samson is one of them. An angel comes to his mother and says, he's going to be great in the eyes of the Lord, and he's going to be a ruler of the people, and you need to raise him as a Nazirite, so make sure that you don't let a razor touch his head, make sure that he never drinks wine, that he comes into contact with dead things, which he does. And so Samson, even though he's raised as a Nazirite, he's keeping all of these Nazirite laws, but on the other hand, he has a particular affinity for Philistine women. His first wife, he marries outside the covenant. He marries a Philistine woman, and at their wedding feast, he comes up with a riddle that he tells the people. He says, I remember the answer to the riddle. I don't remember what the riddle actually. You can go there in Judges. I think it's in chapter 15 or chapter 16. The riddle is something like, what comes out. Well, it has to do with a story. So on his way to the feast, he encounters, or not on his way to the feast, but earlier in Samson's story, he encounters a lion, and the Lord gives him strength, and he kills the lion with his bare hands. As he's passing by the carcass of the lion, he sees that bees have come and built a beehive inside of the lion's carcass. And so he takes and he eats of some of the honey. He goes to the feast, and then he comes up with this riddle where the answer is a beehive inside of a dead lion. Something like, I wish I could remember it, but I just read it like however long this video is ago, maybe plus 10 minutes. But anyway, you can go check it out for yourselves. But he does this and comes up with this riddle, and nobody can answer it. And so all of his wives' relatives are like, "Hey, you gotta see if you can figure out the answer to this riddle, because we don't want to lose, what we've wagered in this." And it was like sets of numbers of clothing and whatnot. And so she eventually says, "Hey, if you love me, you'll trust me." And so he tells her the answer to the riddle. She tells it to her family and friends. They tell Samson, and then Samson's like, my wife betrayed me. And so he goes and he kills a number of people, takes their clothes, and gives them to his wife's family and friends so that he can honor his promise. Now, this does not seem like a very judgy, prophetic. I don't think I'm going to elevate Samson to the status of prophet, but it talks about the Lord's Spirit being with him in a number of cases. And so it makes us confront that binary of you're either all in with the Lord and you enjoy his promised blessings, or you're out and you get none of them. No, here throughout these stories we have very flawed individuals who are not doing things right, but the Lord still is able to give them a portion of his Spirit in a whole lot of different situations. So eventually, Samson's first wife, she is killed. That throws Samson into a rage, and he loses his temper a lot, kills a lot of people. Eventually, he goes over and he's with a Philistine harlot, spends some time with her. The Philistines, eventually they're just so tired of this Samson guy who's just able to thwart any of their attempts at getting rid of him. And so another Philistine woman, Delilah, she comes and they send her to him to try to figure out what the source of his strength is. And knowing that he'd been deceived before by his wife, he gives her a couple of, the source of my strength is if you tie me with particular cords. Then I'll lose all of my strength. Eventually, though, he does come around. She pulls the same thing that his dead wife said. Well, Samson, if you really love me, then you'll trust me. And so he says, if a razor touches my head, then I will lose my strength. And again, it seems a bit mystical. And is that indeed something to do with the hair, or was that type of a placebo thing where knowing that the Lord had his back because of the Nazirite promises that he was keeping? I don't know, because he seems to have no qualms about killing people or being immoral. So again, tough story. But they come, and here's the picture depicted behind me, is they come and they cut his hair, loses his strength. The Philistines are like, we finally got you. They make him a slave for a long time. He's forced to do any number of things. Unfortunately, while he's a slave, that allows his hair to grow back. They're throwing a particular feast. They bring Samson to kind of mock him there. They chain him up between two pillars. And then in Judges chapter 16, verse 28, he prays. It says, "And Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee. Only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." They had gouged out his eyes. And he, reaches out, and the Lord honors his prayer. I have a hard time thinking it's because like his hair grew back to a certain, I don't know. But he does gain strength again. He pulls the pillars down, and everyone who was there is crushed. The Philistine leaders who had just been afflicting Israel, and he's seen as a hero there to the people, not to the Philistines, to his people, and again, just a really, really tough story. At the very end of the book of Judges, we get this statement that kind of goes back to where we see Israel at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses is up in the mountain. He's been there for a long time, and so they ask Aaron to make the golden calf. But there at the very end of Judges 21:25, it reads, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." And I read that statement, and I can't help but draw similarities to a lot of what we see in our society today, that every man does what is right in his own eyes. Well, how do we know that our eyes are looking to the right things? It's important that we have prophetic voices, that we have those who are indeed inspired to come and to tell us hard truths about ourselves, to point out the false gods that we worship, to show us where our allegiances are misaligned. And those are going to come from a lot of different directions, where we are going to be asked sometimes to move past what is comfortable. And other times we're going to be told to hold on to what we know and to ignore the opinions that are swirling out there in the world, to not just latch on to new ideas and new societal trends, but to hold on. So it seems to be this continual balance in the story of God's interactions with his people. And my belief and my testimony is that that's what prophets are for. Prophets, sometimes, yes, they do give us new information about the plan of salvation and help us better understand ourselves and God's interactions with us. But mostly, prophets are there to help us focus on the right things, where God, knowing what he knows about human nature, about societal trends, about all of that, he tells prophets to tell us things way before we need to know them. Do this. Don't do that. Focus on this. You don't need to focus on these things so much anymore. And I'm so grateful that we have a prophet in the church, President Russell M. Nelson, who seems to be very, very willing to do that. That when things need to change, he's willing to change. In whatever sacrifice, personal sacrifice, he needs to make so that he can keep himself open, not just to have the strength to hold on to what we do know, but the strength to let go of some of what we do know and to move into the unknown. President Nelson just seems to be very adept at balancing those forces of tradition and new revelation. And so, I'm sure the Lord did the best with what he had there throughout that book of Judges. But it's very difficult to overcome a people who are wholly given over to doing whatever's right in their own eyes when we become laws unto ourselves, where the most important God to worship is our own. And so my hope is that when we read these stories, we can throw off egocentrism, we can throw off any senses of nationalism or national centrism, of the way that we understand things right now. That's the only right way to understand them, but just to have some humility, because across all of these stories, that's ultimately where things go right, is when people are willing to humble themselves, to seek the Lord's oracles, and then to obey them. And I think that's the best shot we have too, and I share that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.